an analysis of the direct and indirect impact of the pandemic, and then discuss a bit the background against which this pandemic arrived in terms of broad socioeconomic tendencies. And finally, trying to discuss some basically bifurcation that we are facing between something unlikely better and something more likely bad. Now, some optimistic people suggest that the pandemic is the last straw that breaks the camel back, in the sense that is a straw that introduces a discontinuity in an increasingly dysfunctional socioeconomic fabric. I'm more pessimistic, and I think that the camel is going to eat all the straw, and it's going to get even worse. Now, I've got a terrible echo, but I don't know. Can you hear me well?
Yes, Giovanni.
Okay. Well, I think that the answer to this pandemic could have been the opportunity to collectively question the current regime of production and appropriation characterized by a sort of broad rentification, a worsening income distribution, expansion of the domain of the market in domain of social activities that were traditional, at least in Europe, public goods, health, education. Well, in Italy, we are very far ahead of other countries, and long ago we privatized even justice, for example, so we are in the forefront. Instead, the route taken, it seems to me, has been that of answering with a pervasive forms of social control, limitation of individual and collective right, and the common discourse is a sort of iteration of a false dichotomy between economic wealth and health security. I shall come back to that in a second. While not questioning the fact that these repressive, say, policies, to make it very quickly, it is easier to send the army than increase the emergency care units. And this is what we have done in Italy, what they've done in China, of course. But I don't think that the Chinese model is particularly good for a social democratic society. The fundamental point is that the answer to the pandemic, that of course needed to be there, has had a very differentiated impact on income, working condition, and faced a very differentiated access to health services. Now, in Italy especially, but also in other countries, France is in as bad a situation as Italy, and Spain the same. Germany is a much better one because they, around 15 years ago, the OECD explicitly told Germany, you should decrease the number of beds in hospitals because you are not optimizing it and you have too much slack. And Germany basically replied, fuck you. So in Italy, we have an expenditure that remained constant, more or less, in a constant price. Germany has got nearly double. In Italy, we had a dramatic reduction in beds in ICU over the last 10, 15 years. In Germany, you have more than 3 times the ICU than in Germany. And in monetary terms, health expenditure increased of around more than an order of magnitude. To say that, Germany was, as well known, has not been a particularly expansionist country, but has eroded marginally less the welfare system, the public welfare system. A common trend that with a different race that characterized all Europe was, say, the American way in terms of privatization of the health system, and with new big health conglomerate, in Italy, Rotelli, Humanitas, that is Rock, etc., rising, and shrinking public expenditure for public hospital. All this against the background, as you know well, and Antonella and I have been writing a lot on this, against the background of pernicious fiscal austerity measure that damaged especially the South, but were not good either for the people of the North. And the Europe as a whole remained in a near stagnation for more than 10 years. Now, the management of the crisis. It should be clear that I was saying that the answer was basically not a medical one, but essentially a repressive one. Limitation of freedom on the ground of freedom of movement, freedom on the ground of this idea that you have got a trade-off between health and freedom. Well, of course, it is obvious that the economic damage is a positive function of the length of the lockdown, but the important thing is that the damage is very much differentiated across people, social groups, with very little or not too much damage for high income groups, and an extreme damage to the social fabric and to the lower income people. If you want to find the representative lockdown victim in the States is a woman of color with children living in a peripheral neighborhood, possibly in less than 60 square meter apartment. In Italy, is a substitute of color with immigrant, but this is the archetype of the victim. Extending is the almost half of the population in the South that lives on informal works, black jobs, does not have proper social security guarantees, etc. Now, also the stay-at-home that has been the mantra, we work from home, etc., is a privilege for the for the upper echelon of the occupation categories, or a help for a minority, say, people working in call centers that are staying home and they've got to take care of their answer the telephone, take care of the children, trying to cook, etc., which has become real hell. And of course, the social difference reverberates from parent to children. We have an entire generation of kids that is going to be not only literate, but also is forgetting the little bit of socialization that the school was bringing with it. Now, let's not forget that the social fabric has social activities as a fundamental part. I mean, going to the cinema, going to the bar, going to the party chapter, local party chapter. Now it's fading away, but going to church are fundamental socializing activities, not that closing them down come at no cost. I mean, I was seeing a few days ago in New York Times interviews with 700 epidemiologists, so saying, how do you envisage the future? And many of them, I mean, saying, well, I envisage the future more or less like now, all lockdown, 15% even take gloves to open their mail that arrives with the normal mail. They 50% say they will not see freely their friends. I mean, this is the United States of paranoia. This is not the society that I think we like. Of course, all these answers to the pandemic have not only losers, but have got also winners. I mean, all big pharma companies and high-tech provider of remote digital services have climbed enormously in their stock evaluations and in their incomes. Now, in terms of transfer over from the government to the people, how this, what has been the effect? Well, everywhere in the world, even if to different degrees, the public intervention have been essentially anti-redistributive fiscal policies. Furcieri et al., one of the allies, Jonathan Austri from the International Monetary Fund, so not from the Trotskyist Fourth International, emphasizes that this is a general trend worldwide, basically. I mean, if you want to summarize, you have limited protection or no protection at all for informal workers, non-working poor, more so if they're immigrants. Even where you have almost universal basic income, like Italy almost, immigrants are generally excluded, especially non-legal immigrants are certainly excluded. You have got a limited protection for regular employees and small business firms, a much greater umbrella for large non-financial firms. Think of the guaranteed loan to Fiat, FCA, of 6.5 billion euros. And you have a total parachute for financial and real estate rents. I mean, it is amazing that nobody in Italy would say, well, we introduce a moratorium on rents. I mean, if someone has got an income on rents, basically must be reasonably wealthy and can participate to the sacrifice of society. No. I mean, the government is subsidizing tenants to pay rents, but of course, the property is sacred. Now, what one would like to see? One would like to see a reversal of fiscal policy to begin with. I mean, think that the marginal rate of taxation in Italy, when the last reform was introduced in 74, the marginal rate was 73%. It has been fallen to 43. And there's been no fall, on the contrary, on the lower bracket, on the contrary. And with the idea of simplification, when you hear the word simplification or let's reduce the tax bracket, that means let's give bigger and bigger gifts to the rich. The bigger the number of brackets, the more redistributive typically are policies. Now we should go back to serious taxation policy, and we should seriously consider. We have a debate. Antonella and I are part of, and Gennaro too, are part of this ongoing debate of a group on whether we should have a wealth tax or not. But the discussion is more on what type, because I think that there is a little disagreement on, yes, we must have a wealth tax. It is dramatic that in Italy, even the left has enormous difficulties in accepting the ideas. Health policies. Well, of course, these are almost obvious. I mean, we need to increase fast overall public expenditure for the health system, reduce the public, if we've got a budget constraint, reduce the public subsidies to private clinic, and strengthening the role of the family doctors that have been subject to basically to euthanasia, and those that have remained are, for the majority, allow me the word, really son of a bitch. I mean, they asked the tribunals in the Lazio region to be a waiver not to visit at home the COVID patient. And the tribunal said, yes, it's not your duty. Then what is their duty? I don't know. Research and innovation policies. This could be the chance of introducing the famous missions that Mariana Mazzucato is talking about. One of the missions is, of course, in the areas of health. We need the system of research and production of drugs is extremely dysfunctional, in which basically we, taxpayer, pay for basic research, we give the result of basic research to big pharma or biotech that are even worse, animals, and then they do the 3 stages of testing under condition of terrible conflict of interest. There are companies around the world that even in small numbers are specialized in literally massaging the numbers. I'll let you know. I'll let you guess what it means. Even people like Soros suggest that we should expand the domain of public research all the way to stage 3 of testing, and then let big pharma produce under condition of non-exclusiveness, and at that point they will have to charge marginal cost instead of charging what they charge nowadays. Redistribution policies. This is absolutely urgent. Rent need to be curbed. Both real estate and especially financial rent need to be curbed. If you couple the pandemic with such an injustice, this rent will get out of control. One should shift the burden of taxation from wages to profits and from profits to rent. It is extremely urgent to have digital taxation schemes. I mean, even the robber barons of the 1980s in the States, called in this way in the States, were paid some taxes. Now the Google and the Facebook, etc., of this world pay absolutely nothing. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. Labor policies. This one has got to reverse again a tendency over the last 30, 40 years and extend worker rights, including migrant workers and informal workers. This could be a chance of imposing safety conditions to employers and to reduce working hours. Again, the last 50 years have seen an interaction of a secular trend in capitalism to decreasing working hours. And if you add the transportation cost, especially transportation time, especially in the US, working hours have actually increased in the last 30 years or so. And we need more generally to rebalance labor power, increasing real wages, introducing universal income protection, even independently from the contractual framework. Conclusion. In another work, if you're interested, it's on the International Labor Review by myself and Maria Enrica Virgilito. We argue that we were, even before the pandemic, facing a sort of bifurcation between what Chris Freeman and Luc Soto long ago called the economics of hope, that is a more just, egalitarian, green society, or what we call a Blade Runner society, in which you have got a sort of techno-feudalism controlling technology, wealth, and political power, and a wide, you remember the film, a wide lumpen proletariat that does not have marginal access to technologies and does not have any access to political power. I think it's urgent to think of this bifurcation, and my feeling, not very optimistic, is that the current measures are pushing society, Western society, not to talk about Eastern ones, that I think COVID has been an extremely, a very favorable opportunities for the ruling classes in China to experiment forms of unheard of social control. with success in their view. I think that we are taking that second, we are taking the Chinese road in some sort of liberal shows. This is terrible. This is terrible for both for the economy and for the social fabric. This is not a society I would like to live in, and I end here.
Thank you very much, Giovanni, and apologies to everybody for the technical problems that I've been having, but I think I'm back now and I hope you can all hear me. We have about 10 minutes for questions for Giovanni. Can I suggest that people raise their hand in the participants panel, and I'll try to keep track of the order in which people are raising their hand to ask questions. Are there any questions for Giovanni at this time?
Well, since no one's speaking, I have a question. Sorry, I didn't raise my hand. But
go ahead, Antonella, please.
About your data, you said that per capita expenditure on health, public expenditure on health has remained roughly constant, flat, since 2008. I had different data, at least for the years immediately after the crisis, after 2008, and during the strongest austerity measures in 2010, 11, 12. I and Walter Paternesi found data showing that the per capita expenditure was falling actually sensibly in real terms in Italy, about 1.5 percentage point per year for several years. So I was wondering about the source of the data, or whether there had been a recovery after the 2015 or something in health expenditure.
Unfortunately, I think that we have lost Giovanni because so now I try to call him. No.
Okay. Can I suggest then that in the meantime, Antonella, why don't we move on to your presentation?
Okay.
And we'll hope that Giovanni rejoins us, and perhaps there will be a little bit of time at the end of the session for general questions to all of the presenters.
Okay, can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay.
Not yet, no. Yes.
Okay.
Are you here again? Yes.
Yes.
So answer to the question by Antonella.
If you heard it.
Well, I heard half of it, saying that your data show
a reduction in per capita health expenditure in real terms between, say, 2008 and 2015. I think that was the period.
Yes, and you're absolutely right. If it is an expenditure to the of the public for the public, you're absolutely right. I used sort of play against ourselves and included also all the transfer to the private.
Okay.
But you're right. The strict public expenditure in public hospital, yes, I've got the same figure.
Okay, fine. Just to understand.
Yeah.
Okay.
So now that Giovanni has managed to rejoin us, are there any questions specifically for Giovanni at this time? I don't see any others. So what I'm going to suggest then, Antonella, will move on to your presentation, and perhaps there'll be a little bit of time at the end of the session for general questions.
Okay, so I assume you are seeing the slides. And
yes,
let me say that, okay, I don't know why, but the slides are not, okay, sorry. I'm not going to be very, this paper is not a technical paper. I'm just summarizing a number of considerations and problems concerning the macroeconomic outlook, particularly in Europe and in Italy, as a consequence of the pandemic and what will happen immediately afterwards. And in order to do that, I would like to mention some evolutions in the way of looking at the impact of macroeconomic policies and recessions on the economy. So let's say the standard version that we still find in textbooks and was taught and was the sort of, how can I say, the shared view in the mainstream before 2008 was that restrictive fiscal policies have negative effects in the short term, transitory negative effects, but their effect is neutral or even positive in the medium to long run because restrictive fiscal policy open the space, let's say, for growth in private expenditure, particularly in private investment. Against this sort of common sense shared view in macroeconomics, in the 2000s, we saw the emergence and spread of ideas related to the so-called expansionary austerity thesis, according to which austerity policies would not have or could not have negative effect on GDP even in the short run and would exclusively have positive effect on GDP. These were the theses by Alessin and others, mostly, I should say, Italian economists, but with an international profile. This thesis was immediately criticized not only by, say, Keynesian economists, but even by establishment economists, particularly at the IMF. Many papers criticized those conclusions and even the data behind it and the methodology behind it. But the expansionary austerity thesis was I think, very important in Europe and in Italy as well, to provide support to the adoption of austerity policies immediately after the 2008 crisis. Many officials, high-standing officials, claimed that those policies would give rise to sustained growth. Okay, that was often stated even in public speeches by Juncker and others, and was very often heard in Italy. Of course, after 2008, there was new developments even in mainstream macroeconomic literature, and the results of this literature, mostly empirical, led to quite different conclusions. Particularly, a lot of papers have shown that restrictive fiscal policies always have negative effects on GDP as a first impact. Not only that, but that the negative effect of such policies, as well as the negative effect of recessions, do not have just transitory short-term effects, negative effects, but also persistent effects. So many papers, even by Blanchard, Summers, and others, have shown that even when growth resumes, the GDP trajectory remains below the earlier one. That is to say, there is a permanent, lasting damage in terms of like a permanent level effect that is not recovered even after the austerity policies or recession end. So this is the hysteresis literature, just to use the label. Another result, which is quite important, is that the effects of fiscal policies were found to be stronger in recessions or stagnation than they are in expansion. That is to say that the restrictive fiscal policy when they are carried out in an economy which is already in suffering, which is already in a crisis, cause greater damage than if they were carried out in an healthy economy. So if you return too soon, let's say, to austerity after a recession, that's going to have a great negative impact. The implications that some have taken from, derived from these conclusions is that it may happen, and it has in fact generally happened after 2008, particularly in Europe, that restrictive fiscal policies cause an increase of the debt to GDP ratio. So they're not a cure, but rather a worsening of the problem. And some have even gone so as far as to say that expansionary fiscal policies, symmetrically, if they have a sufficiently high impact on GDP, may reduce the debt ratio, the debt to GDP ratio. So that, in fact, deficit spending policies, provided that the spending has a high multiplier, can be a solution or can alleviate, can reduce the debt to GDP ratio. And these views have even percolated into European institutions and documents, although this does not mean that they are now prevalent. I'm not meaning that. They're far from being prevalent. But it is interesting that in a technical document accompanying the Commission proposal, the European Commission proposal on the so-called Recovery Fund, we can read that the package is self-financing, provided that I'm not going to read the whole piece, but provided the multiplier is high enough, and this will have a favorable effect on the debt to GDP ratio in the European Union. And the same effect is calculated by this document to be high, very high, for high debt economies. Note that the document, this technical document by the Commission, European Commission staff, says that this spending, this beneficial effect on the debt to GDP ratio is there if the spending is additional. I mean, if the funds provided under this proposal are going to be on top of what would have been the normal course of event. So, in the light of which of these results, which have been provided by the literature, I think it is imperative, but not yet quite generalized in the public discourse, that it is not true that more deficits always mean more debt to GDP ratio. It may well be the opposite in some instances, and particularly austerity measures are not necessarily the cure for high debt to GDP ratios, because GDP is not independent from public budget policies. This is a message which, I don't know, perhaps in the United States, Mark, is now quite accepted, but it's very, seems to be not yet penetrated, let's say, in the public discourse in Italy and Europe. So now coming to the policy responses to the pandemic, I'm still talking mainly about macroeconomic responses. In fact, what we have seen after the pandemic, maybe also because of the enormous shock, gigantic shock provoked by this crisis, we have seen everywhere a lot of expansionary fiscal policies, much more than after 2008. And however, there are differences, okay? Because according to data provided by the International Monetary Fund, In the US, there have been a huge, I'm talking just about fiscal measures. So that means more public expenditure and less taxes. I'm not talking about guarantees to loans provided to firms, etc., which also have had an important role. But I'm just talking about spending or fiscal cuts. Fiscal reduction or tax reduction. So in the United States, the fiscal measures have amounted to about 15% of GDP. In Japan, about 21% of GDP. In Germany is close to the US with 14% of GDP. While at the present time in Italy, the total measures assumed have been 7% of GDP. And these differences that we see between Germany and Italy are true also for Spain and other European countries. So a first observation is that, which is close to what Giovanni was saying about social differences. We also see a lot of differences in macroeconomic policies, which appear to be reinforcing processes of divergence, regional and national divergences that were already underway in a very marked way before the pandemic. So in the Eurozone, the processes of divergence are going to be accelerated and emphasized by the pandemic and the reaction, the macroeconomic reactions to it. Another thing that has to be noted that there is a strong uncertainty in Europe. The reason, so why is it that Italy or Spain?
Sorry, Antonella, but perhaps somebody wrote to me that perhaps there is a problem with your slide because you remain with the first slide.
I'm not. So well, let me.
You are with the slide 24.
I think you are not sharing the right window.
Yes, perhaps there is some problems. So anyway, we managed to follow you because you are very clear, so it's not a problem. But there is some.
Let me try to share the screen again, just to see if I can change. What do you see now?
Now I see again.
You say, I know.
Yes, now, yes.
Now it's moving.
You are shifting slide. Yes.
Is it moving now? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm sorry, I didn't realize. Okay, so as I said, these differences in the responses within the Eurozone are connected to the uncertainty about the fact that the fiscal rules have been suspended but not revised. So, I mean, I think that in Italy, like in Spain and other countries, there is a fear that spending more means increasing too much the debt to GDP ratio and then creating difficulty soon after the pandemic will be over because the old rules will be restated, will come back. Of course, these fears may be mistaken in a sense because it might quite be the case that if we now spend too little, in fact, the GDP fall will be much greater, and hence the debt to GDP ratio after the pandemic is over will be worse than what it would have been with more spending. But I think that the preoccupations of many governments in the, let's say, European periphery is the cause of the caution, a lot of caution in increasing spending to the extent in which it has been increased in Germany. So the fiscal rules have not been revised, and of course there is also uncertainty, and we'll come back to that, about the monetary policy, because there has been a suspension of the rule, but not but the rules will probably come back. So the suspension has been temporary. And the European measure of spending have not been very, very wide. There is this fund for unemployment and some figures, some money for guarantees, for loans, but nothing big enough to have a macroeconomic impact in the Europe as a whole, because all these measures are meant to be addressed to 27 countries. The main measure have to do with the stability fund, the so-called pandemic provision from the stability mechanism, and the Next Generation EU or Recovery Fund, which I will discuss later. So far, all the additional spending is mainly at the national level, and has been funded by issuing public bonds. In the face of these, monetary policies, as we know, has been very active. The European Central Bank has launched programs of purchase of public bonds. But again, the flexibility, the dimension of the intervention, and the flexibility regarding the rules, the proportionality rules about the purchases have been suspended, but are not overcome. So again, there is an uncertainty surrounding what the monetary policy will be in the future. As we know, in Germany and also in other countries, there is opposition to this new role assumed by the European Central Bank, and it's open to question what will happen in the future. In this very uncertain context, Italy arrives with a high debt to GDP ratio. This high debt to GDP ratio comes from far back in the past, from the end of the 80s, when our debt to GDP was 120%. Since then, we are the only country in Europe which ran primary surpluses for 30 years in a row with no breaks. And this with low interest rate up to 2008 allowed, between the beginning of the 90s to 2008, allowed a reduction of the ratio to 100%, albeit with high cost in terms of growth, and I would say also of technological innovation and productivity, because the two things go together. If the country doesn't grow very much, and if there is no pull from aggregate demand growth, also productivity growth tends to suffer. Moreover, these 30 years of surpluses have also, eroded the quality of the welfare state and of all public infrastructures. But in 2008, the fall in GDP brought the ratio back to high level, 120%, and austerity policies, which led to a further fall in GDP between 2012 and 2011 and 2013, almost 5% point less fall of GDP, led to a new peak in the debt to GDP ratio, which arrived at around 130 and remained there. Before the pandemic, that is in 2019, Italy had not yet recovered the levels of GDP and employment measured in hours that it had in 2007. So really completely lost decade, or more than a decade, for the Italian economy. And of course, this tells us that the very serious impact of the pandemic will further deteriorate already deteriorated situation. So the forecast is a fall of GDP around 10% this year, with the recovery of perhaps half that percentage in the next year, which would bring our debt to GDP ratio somewhere between 160 and 155%. And so, though Italy still has some strengths, such as high private wealth, a positive trade balance, and a net external debt close to zero, under the current monetary fiscal rules, which, I repeat, have been suspended but are still there, the high debt to GDP ratio is going to be a problem. And unfortunately, the outlook is not, I think, is very, I don't think it's very positive. These rules are very hard to change. The processes of decision making in Europe are very complicated, very long, and it is widely recognized that fiscal rules are procyclical, that they tend to amplify recessions. Even Lagarde has maintained that, but it's not clear whether they will be changed. So what could be the solutions for Italy, and not only for Italy, in this situation? I think the ideal way out, not only for Italy, but for also other countries. Now the debt to GDP ratio has increased a lot, also in France, in Spain, and in other countries. So I think a very good solution would be the transformation in perpetuities of very long maturity bonds, extremely long maturity bonds, of the public debt that is already in the hands of the central bank, of national banks, which has been purchased on the mandate of the European Central Bank. This measure has in fact been proposed by many people, not just Keynesian or critical economists, also personalities in the institutions and so on. But for the moment, at least, Lagarde has stated that this is clearly not on the agenda, is not something which is possible to think about. But what it would at least be necessary is a guarantee, but an explicit guarantee on the part of the central bank, of the rollover of the debt stock and the continuing of the policy of closing or keeping very, very small the spreads between the interest paid on on bonds from different countries, which is, by the way, what central banks are doing everywhere outside the Eurozone. But for the Eurozone, this is not clearly going to take place. It's very uncertain. And for Italy, as well as for other highly indebted countries, the only possible narrow path is to manage to have an interest rate on loans lower than the rate of growth of the economy. Okay, so because as we know, if the primary budget is balanced, if this inequality holds, then the ratio will tend to diminish. And since Italy is not only at the balanced primary budget, but a surplus primary budget, this already would allow some more space. And if this inequality holds, we might even have space for a little bit of deficit spending. But so the interest rate is in the hand of the central bank in a crucial way, and the continuing intervention of the central bank to keep the interest rate low is absolutely essential for Italy, although it's not enough for growth, but it is essential for keeping interest rates and interest payments manageable. And the way to sustain growth, on the other hand, I don't see any other way than to have. One way would be to promote exports, but it is not. The global markets don't seem to be in a situation for many reasons. In a situation that can allow steep growth in exports. So the only other way is a fiscal stimuli coming either from European project or national expenditure. Private investments are, of course, very important to ensure accumulation and growth, but we know from economic analysis that at the aggregate level, the single most important factor in stimulating private investment is aggregate demand growth. So we cannot hope in a recovery of private investments if we don't restore growth in aggregate demand. So we need fiscal stimulus, and we need expenditures that have a high fiscal multipliers. These are, as we know, tax reductions. I'm mentioning it because in Italy, and I think also elsewhere, unfortunately, policymakers always talk about reducing taxes, okay, to someone, particularly to firms, to companies. This, we know, doesn't have much impact on the economy, while we know that the highest multipliers are those of public investment and public consumption. So those two, those should be the focus of more spending. If we don't manage to stay into this path of managing to stimulate growth and keep interest rate low, I don't think there is. I think the future is very black. If we go back to austerity policies, it seems to be in the heads of many policymakers in Italy and Europe. This would rather cause a steep increase in the debt to GDP ratio, besides causing impoverishment and unemployment. And the result would be a vicious circle that would lead the country to have to choose between exiting the euro or going into a default on all or part of public debt, which would cause a banking crisis and the intervention of the Troika, which is not so a Greek outlook, just to explain it. Within this context, what could be the role of the two major European measures, the stability mechanism, the funds for the pandemic within the stability mechanism, and the recovery fund? I would not spend too much time, because I think I'm already late, on the European stability mechanism, because this it's just a loan which would still add to public debt, ensure a very small savings on interest payments, very little, and impose risks, because although there is no ex ante conditionality to obtain these funds, provided they are aimed for health expenditure, there is clearly stated into the treaties, into the rules, and there is a post-program surveillance on the public public accounting, on the public balance, on the public budget, and as it has happened in the past, even just negative comments on the state of public finances by officials of the European Stability Mechanism would cause too much trouble in the financial markets, in the markets for Italian bonds, that the cost could be extremely high, even just because of that. So I think a bit different and more useful is the so-called Next Recovery Fund or Next Generation EU proposal by the Commission in the current form. Note that this has been discussed, a proposal has been formed, but it's not yet finally approved and regulated. So it seems that it will be there, but it's still not there. For Italy, this should represent a total of 200 billion available, of which about 80, almost 80 would be given as so-called grants, but be careful, because grants doesn't mean that it's the total is a transfer, let's say. Because of this 80 billion, in fact, only 30 billions are net transfers. All the rest must be returned. So 50 billions of the so-called grants plus all the rest, which are loans, have to be repaid. And the loans are also in the accounting are part of public debt. So they add to public debt. This doesn't mean that there are no advantages, or so the advantage is not in the net transfer, but there is an advantage. That is to say that to fund the program, the Commission will turn to financial market and issue its own bonds with very long maturities, up to 2058, and low interest rate, presumably. And I think that this mechanism is indeed what is useful. The idea that you can use this money in the relatively short run, in the next 3-4 years, and then repay it in the very long term, makes the repayment easier, and the macroeconomic, the positive, Keynes said, macroeconomic impact much positive, interesting. Interest rates would be paid out of own resources, but own resources of the Commission are taxes which are paid by firms or people in each country. So they will add to, in the last instance, they're paid out of taxation that takes place within each national state. So, as I said, most of this money will be repaid possibly in the medium to very long term. And how will the country repay it? By issuing national public bonds. This is unavoidable. But the long maturity, as I said, is very positive. This is just the mechanism. As I said, the loans must be returned, grants must be, assigned on the basis of certain criteria, unemployment, GDP loss, whereas they are returned on the basis of the weight of the country in the European GDP. But the net for Italy is what I just mentioned, 30 billions. I think the debate about this fund in Italy, as it often is the case when the information deals with European matters, have been very unclear. So there is very little, it's not a present, it's not a fiscal transfer. It is just in a small, relatively small amount. This is not why the thing is useful. What is useful is that it can be spent and in public investment and other forms of public investment, public expenditure now, and returned in the possibly long term. And the other advantage, if this will be the case, because it's not clear at all, would be the possibility of a temporary overcoming of European fiscal rules if somehow this spending on the basis of the plans presented as part of this recovery plan will be, in addition to what would be normally accepted as a deficit spending in the public budget. But if this will be the case, it's not clear at all at the moment. And in Italy, at least, it increasingly appears to be the case that the funds for the recovery plan will be, to a large extent, used to finance investment projects that were already there. So they will be used to a large extent in substitution and not in addition of what would have been the normal course of public spending. If this is the case, the macroeconomic impact of the recovery plan will be much more limited, and this will not help to exit the high debt to GDP ratio through growth. So I think that it is very important for policymakers to begin to enter into a different way of thinking and understand that spending may be the way out of high debt to GDP ratios, but this seems to be still quite far away, and I think that the future for Europe and for Italy is very uncertain.
Thanks very much, Antonella. Thank you. I think we just have time for a couple of questions. I'll invite participants to use the raise hand function again, if anybody would like to. Giovanni, please go ahead.
We are, Antonella and I are, as usual, on the same page. I just wanted to add a little note, a margin, an epsilon note of optimism, in the sense that it is true that even grants have got to be repaid sooner or later. But who knows? I mean, it might well be that in 10 years' time or so, we'll have some rudimentary European Minister of Finance and some permanent loan facility on the side of the European Union. So I wouldn't. It's the same argument that you are making about the perpetuities or very long term. I mean, in 100 years, who knows? I mean, maybe the economy will not even be there. So I think that both the loans and the grants are okay, more or less. You and I are also absolutely on the same page on the fact that even discussing about the mass, using the mass is delirious, because it's very little, and it's like saying, signing a self-warrant in which you can go to jail any day. I mean, it's just crazy. Also, on the contrary, I would like to underline what you were saying, that my expectation, and I think your expectation, is that when the pandemic, the crisis will end, the German and generally also our own economists, I mean, are not to name names, are Bocconi friends, so to speak, will come in and say, children, the break is over, now back to school, and back to discipline. I mean, it reminds me of what is going to happen. It reminds me of what was happening after World War I, in which people like of the free market school used to say, dear workers, don't think that all the gains that you got during World War I will remain forever. I mean, now we go back to normal. and normal is austerity. I expect the German Grosse Deutschland to do the same thing. In exceptional times, yes, we gave you money. Now the old rules will apply again. And in fact, I mean, with good rational expectation, Lucrezia Reichen comes in and says, don't think that the German will give you this money for free. You've got to show submissiveness and discipline. Otherwise, they will not trust you, and they will continue to think that you spend the money in wine and women, like the commissioner said. So yes, this is something that we should say clear and loud, that this pandemic should represent a long-term permanent discontinuity, not an exceptional intervention for exceptional times. And I totally agree with you. Yeah.
Shall I comment?
Yes. Respond?
Yes, Giovanni, I fully agree with you. Let me explain better. I don't think the problem is so much the fact that the fact that these loans we receive with the recovery plan have to be returned. But I think that the problem is precisely what you said, that since there is a high risk that the old rules will come back, and the old rules impose some strict limits on deficit spending, and also require that we reduce the debt to GDP ratio through austerity. Since from an accounting point of view, these loans are counted as public debt, there is the high risk that even if we get them, we'll not spend them as additions, so it's real stimulus to the economy, but that we will spend them in substitution of what would normally be the usual public budget and so on. So it's not so much that we have to return them, the problem, because if you can spend now a return in 50 years, that's fine. It has a macroeconomic impact, it has a Keynesian effect. You spend first and return later. The point is that we might be expected to, or imposed to, cut other items because we are spending the recovery plan, and this would not have any macroeconomic impact. This is my worry.
Absolutely. If I may add a caveat, though, is that if I've seen the draft, as you have seen the draft of how we plan to spend it, well, I'm tempted to write to the European Union, please don't give us the money, because it's something absolutely outrageous. I mean, the plan. So we also face this incompetence on the side of spending.
So in view of the time, I'm going to suggest we move on to Gennaro's presentation so that he has time to...
There was, I think, a question from Gennaro. Gennaro, you want...
I wanted to make a brief comment. I could not raise my hand using Teams. Anyway, you said that reducing taxes has a lower multiplier, and I absolutely agree. Our friend Jackert has done great studies on that. But, you know, the Bocconi crowd, which are the guys that our governors listen to, have the opposite view. So they still believe that reducing taxes will be more expansionary, even if the IMF has changed its view. So, you know, we should keep that in mind.
I know.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, Gennaro, over to you. Again, we'll go for 30 minutes and try to keep the last 10 minutes of the session for questions.
Thank you. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Good. I was hoping not to get into the troubles of my friends. So, first of all, this is a joint work with my young co-author, which happens to be my son. He dedicated his PhD thesis to developing a stock flow model for Italy, and we are now using it to try to understand what's going to happen. Now, I have the problem, or maybe the gift of speaking after Giovanni and Antonella, and they already covered part of the things I'm going to say, so I can be quicker and leave more time for discussion. Also because I fully agree with what they said. So I fully agree with Giovanni that Italy, the pandemic has hit Italy at a time where we already had severe problems. So this is, a simple chart where we can draw a trend line for the years before 2000. And you can see that in the last 20 years, Italy has been growing much less or has been stagnating with respect to its previous trend. If we focus on the most recent period, then we know we had a first huge recession following the Great Recession in the United States, then another one with the so-called sovereign debt crisis, and the pandemic is the third one in a row after Italy never recovered from the previous two recessions. So real GDP or real GDP per capita in 2019 was still below the level it had reached in 2007. Now, I already made a spoiler in this chart because I'm showing the projection we have for the end of the pandemic. I will discuss this more at the end, but you can see that we project a recovery, and the recovery, most of the recovery is just, bouncing back. If you close all the activities because of the pandemic, and then you reopen, and then firms' business start to sell again, GDP increases, but it will not increase enough to go back to where it was. So there's nothing to cheer about the speed of this recovery, assuming that we will get it. Now, the crisis of Italy is, before the pandemic, was also a crisis in relative terms compared to other partner countries, but I don't want to spend too much time on the past, which is past. There has been a long discussion in Italy on whether the main reason for the stagnation that started in around 2000 was due to the euro or to the the external constraint that Italy chose to self-impose to itself, adopting the common currency at a time when its inflation rate was still higher than that of its main European competitors like Germany. So if you enter a common currency area and your major competitor is more competitive than you are, and you can no longer devalue your exchange rate, you're bound to have trouble unless you do something, and this something would mean what is called usually internal devaluation. So these factors do play a role. I've written a paper with Sergio Cisarato to discuss some of them, but there were also other problems which started earlier. The divorce between the Bank of Italy and the Treasury 1981, which generated an increase in the interest rate on public debt, which implied larger and larger government deficit, even when governments were achieving a fiscal surplus. the policy of the Bank of Italy against a further devaluation of the lira after 1992. Then other policies that Giovanni also mentioned about the labor market. We had a series of reforms which attacked the rights of the workers and also of pensioners, of retired people. And the effect should have been to increase the competitiveness of the labor market and to increase employment. But what happened was that inferior types of jobs were created. We started to have the very large and growing share of part-time workers who are part-time workers because they cannot find a full-time job. And this problem is doubled by the fact that wages have been stagnating. So the working poor phenomenon has extended to Italy as well. Giovanni Dosi also mentioned the trouble with privatization. In the 1990s, government started to privatize. This decreased the ability of the Italian system as a whole to produce innovation, and whether these privatizations were successful is a matter that can be discussed, but I am very skeptical. As in other countries, we had a progressive concentration of income and wealth. These are all elements of the so-called neoliberal agenda. And these have also been working against the increase in investment in Italy. These problems were there before the Great Recession, and after the Great Recession, we got the sovereign debt crisis that started in Greece, and the austerity measures were put in place. So the austerity measures started mostly with the Monti government. As I will show you, we had a decrease in most components of public expenditure and a relative increase in taxation. And this went along with the labor market reforms I've just mentioned. So Italy, as I argue with Sergio Cesarato, Italy had a policy up to the 1980s to try to achieve full employment through government expenditure, through fiscal policy. So in the 1980s, and the fiscal policy was mainly expansionary when net exports were not doing well. So if exports were pulling demand, then fiscal policy could be less expansionary, but the government tried to fill the gap in aggregate demand when exports were not there. So with the 80s, we slowly started a process where we wanted to depend on the growth of exports again. As you all know, Italy is split into a northern region, which is more industrialized, and a southern region, which is not so much industrialized. It was industrialized by public companies that were progressively dismantled. So if in a dual country, you start adopting a strategy which is of export-led growth, the northern region will grow faster than the southern region, and your regional disparities will start to be increased. So fiscal austerity took the form of a decrease in what we call government consumption. There was an increase in the third chart on the bottom left in other transfers. Pensions were not increasing that much, but so fiscal policy was reduced overall, and there was a shift from the production of public services to more transfers. Luckily, interest payments were reduced because of the general decline in interest rates, but still, from the expenditure side, the fiscal policy did not help. From the revenue side, the tax rates were really stable, and you know that if tax rates are stable at a time of a recession, this implies a growing tax burden for taxpayers. So also from the income side, 1 year ago, and we were in a sense optimistic, or more optimistic than other models for what would have happened in Italy in 2020. We were estimating a modest growth of 1.4%, but MEF is the Ministry of Finance, was predicting an even lower growth rate. So with this Italian model, we are kind of reverting the Levy Institute tradition of being Cassandras. We're always giving the worst prediction for the country they're studying. Now, obviously, all predictions made last year were completely off track when the pandemic started, because nobody could predict that a pandemic would come up and force countries to shut down businesses. So the discussion which I will present now is based on the projections we made in September, when the first 2 quarters of 2020 were already passed, and we had data to know what happened to income and expenditure and trade and so on. And now we are more pessimistic than other forecasters for 2020, but a little more optimistic for 2021 and 22. So the impact has been roughly the same across our European partners, as you can measure it from the fall in real GDP. And one could say, first of all, well, I don't think there's a need to discuss why GDP income has fallen during the pandemic, because in Italy, as elsewhere, the government shut down most businesses, and therefore there was no production. Earners were not earning anything, and so on. And I'll come back to whether something better could have been done in a few minutes. Has the government done enough? And the government, up to the end of September, which is when we wrote this report, had issued this first decree for 20 billion euro in different type of expenditure. And most of these 20 billions, which are not very much, had been put in place by September. So these were, I think it was issued in March, but it took many months before the money started to arrive to workers who were become unemployed, or to small businesses. The second decree is adding another 55 billion for this year and much less for the coming years. And the third one, it passed in August, was adding another 25 billion. All of this money in September, most of this money had not been spent. So most probably the government did too little and they did too late. Now it looks like they are being more efficient in the last few weeks with the so-called ristori for the lockdown we are currently in. But still, the amount of fiscal transfers that have been put in place have been too little. So why is this so? And here I can connect with what Antonella was saying. in Italy, everyone is obsessed with the size of our public debt. So the first priority has always been how to reduce public debt. We as heterodox economists have failed to convey the idea that if you cut the numerator, the deficit, the impact on the denominator is likely to be larger, so that the debt to GDP ratio will not be reduced by restrictive fiscal policies because the multiplier of government expenditure is not small, contrary to what the mainstream believes, and therefore any austerity policy will fail the target of reducing the debt to GDP ratio. It will usually obtain other targets which are not usually mentioned by politicians in terms of, you know, who is gaining from privatizing public firms and who is gaining from some type of austerity policies and so on. There was something else I wanted to mention in connection with what Giovanni Dosi said. He said that there was no moratorium on rents, and I fully agree. I wrote a little note a couple of weeks ago to publicize in Italy a paper by Jan Kregel of the Levy Institute. So Jan was suggesting that if we have to use the shutdown of economic activities in order to stop the pandemic, we in a sense should follow the Chinese example in that we should try to make the shutdown as complete as possible and stop all the payments that are normally due. It's not just delay them, so all the rents should have, all payments of rents should have been stopped, all payments of taxes should have been stopped, all the payments of interest on mortgages should have been stopped. Because if you just delay them, you are accumulating debt that has to be repaid once the crisis is over, and this debt will hinder, will be an obstacle to the recovery. And if you do nothing or you do too little, as we have done, then you are not making the rentier pay their fair share of the cost of the pandemic. So some voices were out there to discuss this, but as usual, they have not been heard. Something else that the government has done made me happy because it was in a direction of a proposal that I've made along with others for some time, which is that we are in a common currency area. Exiting the euro is not a politically viable option, and maybe it's not a politically desirable option in terms of the electorate, but still the common currency adopted by countries which keep strong divergences is a straitjacket that must be overcome one way or another. So one way to overcome this would be to introduce some kind of fiscal currency, so a currency that the government issues and accepts in taxation, which is denominated in euro, is not the legal currency, but can be used to fund additional expenditure as long as who receives it is willing to accept it. Now, the government has introduced a similar type of proposal for restructuring buildings, for buying electric bikes, and for going on vacation. So it is a small plan so far, but now it seems that they are making this fiscal certificates transferable and possibly a circuit to transmit the ownership of this fiscal certificate from one private individual to another is being put in place so that the government can stimulate, as it has been doing, private investment without the need to fund this private investment through euro, but only through future taxes that the government will lose when these fiscal certificates will come to maturity. So this is something we have proposed. This government has adopted it without linking in any way these things to the debate on the fiscal currency, but I think this is a good move, but it is again too little for having an impact. So let's come at our projections and what we think is going to happen for the future. And you may be wondering if you have any knowledge of macroeconomic modeling on how do we dare use a macroeconomic model to make a prediction in such times of high uncertainty. So what we did is what happens when you get this huge shock is that your model obviously goes off track. And if you try to introduce the latest data on which are affected by the pandemic into the estimates of your model, since the sample covering the pandemic is very short, your model you cannot capture from an econometric point of view, you cannot capture properly the impact in this way. So what we have done is to estimate the model using data up to 2019, so without taking the pandemic into account, then add the data for 2020 that we already have and check the simulation error that the model had in 2020 for the first half of the year. And these are our estimates of the impact of the pandemic on the behavior of households and firms on top of the impact which lower their income or their profits. So the model knows that in 2020 the income of households has fallen, and therefore consumption will be lower. But on top of this effect, since people are scared and since people cannot go out from their homes, we had an additional fall in consumption by 7% and 10% in the first 2 quarters of the year, a similar fall in investment and a large fall in trade when trade was roughly suspended in the second quarter of the year. So we use these estimates to try to predict what is going to happen. So basically we say if the behavior of households and firms will remain strongly affected by the pandemic, then we will not have any recovery. If the pandemic ends and we reopen, then people will slowly go back to their previous habits, hopefully, and we will have somewhat larger growth. So our relatively optimistic projections for next year and 2021 are based on the idea that the pandemic would be over, which was wrong, our idea was wrong, and therefore we shall see. We may be on track for 2020 because we did not predict that another wave of contagion will come out and another shutdown will happen. But on the other hand, the government has been more effective, so there's been a negative effect from the pandemic, a positive effect from fiscal policy, and if they compensate, our projection of a fall slightly larger than 10% might be on track. What about next year? So it's a time of fundamental uncertainty in the Knightian sense. And also we chose to give some projections on the basis of our opinion on households and firms' behavior and trade, but not to simulate specifically the impacts of the recovery plan that Antonella has discussed. So why is that? First of all, the recovery plan is still very much up in the air. We don't really know whether it will be put in place or not. If it is put in place, nobody will see any euro before the third quarter of next year. And also, Antonella said that she's worried, and rightly so, I think, because the recovery funds can be maybe used to fund existing investment projects, and therefore they will not add an additional stimulus to the economy. I think Antonella is correct also because our Ministry of Finance has said a number of times that as soon as this madness of the pandemic is over, the austerity program will become a priority again, and therefore if additional funds will come in from Europe, they will be used to reduce, to bring the accounts in check, and so to reduce other expenditure will be reduced. But I also have another reason for doubts. If I understand what Francesco Saraceno is discussing about European funds. So European funds are being established because we have an health emergency, but also because there are a number of projects which imply externalities on a European scale. So the pandemic does create externalities. If one country is unable to stop the pandemic and the other countries are able to stop them, the country where the virus is still going around will infect the other countries back. So there is the need for cooperation, for putting things together to reach common goals. As far as I can see, these recovery plans are meant to be targeted to projects which have a European vision. So they not necessarily match the priorities of Italy or of specific Italian regions. I don't know how our Minister of the Foreign Affairs says they will use them to cut taxes. It doesn't sound right. So this is very much up in the air. And on the other hand, the government nowadays has no liquidity problem. So the Ministry of Finance just announced that it will not issue new bonds that were planned to be issued in December because they already have enough liquidity and they do not need to get additional funds. So if the government had a project to start again, it could start immediately without waiting for any external fund, but nobody is talking about that. So we were proposing a very simple starting point, which has been proposed at different times by different people, starting in 2018. Bianco and others made a comparison of public employees in Italy against public employees in other European countries, and they found that Italy has a lower share in all the type of public or services where the public is also operating. So when we talk about health activities, we are including also the private business producing health services, not just the public. So Ranieri published a similar study based on the same data I'm showing here. And this implies that if we want to bring Italy on average to the Eurozone or to the European Union, we could employ more than 1 million additional people in the public sector. So hiring 1 million or 1.5 million additional people in the public sector would bring us in line with the rest of Europe to provide public services. And what we have done in terms of model simulation is to show the implications for the debt to GDP ratio. And what we find is that if this type of expansionary fiscal policy is adopted from the demand side and from the debt to GDP accounting, it will not create any trouble. The debt to GDP would tend to stabilize because of faster GDP growth. And most of the other things that also Giovanni Dosi was mentioning on the need to restart research, to restart productivity, etc., need a strategy from the government. Now, our public employees are much older on average than our European partners. Hiring a large number of younger qualified workers would remove additional obstacles to the ability of the public sector as a whole to have some strategic plan. I must say that with the pessimistic note, that also all the players should play their part. And in Italy, there is also this stigma on public employees as people who don't do nothing. Okay, and yesterday, I think in my region, the trade unions of the school workers said that they want, there's a protest from workers in the public schools. They do not want to teach online when there is a weather alert. Now, this type of requests goes against what is my vision of the public sector as, pulling the economy out of stagnation and into a brighter future. If trade unions in the public sector tend to only defend, the right not to do anything, then we're not going to go very far. So I think I can close here. I totally agree with Giovanni Dosi and his pessimism. The pandemic could have been the occasion to fix a lot of structural problems in the Italian economy. It made clear how many workers are in the shadow economy and do not appear anywhere. And when an emergency happens, they are not registered, they cannot get subsidies, and there's nothing to rely upon. It made clear how large sectors of services do not pay their share of taxes because their share of taxes is their tax rate is too high. So it made clear that we urgently need a tax reform, new rules governing labor to reduce the size of the shadow sector, reduce the amount of tax elusion and evasion in the lines that Giovanni already mentioned. But I am afraid that as he is, we will not see much of this coming. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Gennaro. We're hard up against the time for the end of the session, but I think we do have time for at least one question. Again, if anybody would like to use the raise hand function, are there any questions or comments for Gennaro? Perhaps I could just ask you a quick question myself, Gennaro. This is, I'm sort of anticipating something that I'm going to say tomorrow myself. That I'll try to relate it back to your projection. You showed us the graphic of your bounce back recession, and later on you talked about the uncertainty, of course, that surrounds those projections. Do you see any prospect for things being potentially worse than that bounce back scenario? What mechanisms do you think might unfold over the next 18 months or so that could lead to, let's say, at least a more persistent reduction in GDP below the pre-COVID crisis level?
I think this is something that Antonella mentioned about hysteresis. So in Italy, there is a very large number of very small firms who were closed with the lockdown, and everyone is wondering, will this firm reopen when the emergency is over? Will they be substituted by multinationals operating, or we'll just lose this productive capital? So if we lose a substantial amount of productive capital, then the consequences will be even worse.
Yeah. Antonella, please go ahead.
Yes, stimulated by this comment on what will happen after the pandemic is over, because your projection seems to assume that as productive activity goes back to normal and consumption in some sense goes back to normal, then the economy can return to the earlier level. But the point is, will the ability of spending, that is income, disposable income, will it be the same? This is to be doubted, I think, because I don't think the support the government is giving to families, workers, etc., is such that the disposable income after the pandemic will be, or during the pandemic is the same. So it's not clear that the economy can go back to the same level, because it's not clear that people will be able to spend as much as before, for one thing.
I agree with you, and as I had in my last slide, if we have a vision, we can try to do something so that the economy recovers. If we do nothing as a government, then it's likely that the fall in income and expenditure will last much longer.
Okay, are there any final questions, comments? I think we've reached the end of the session. So I just want to end then by thanking Giovanni, Antonella, and Gennaro for 3 splendid presentations. My apologies for contributing to technical difficulties at the start of the session there, but can we at least, if we take ourselves off mute, show our appreciation for the 3 presentations? Let's just end by with a round of applause here.
Thank you.
I actually I have to take my leave. I have to teach, but I'm hoping to join the parallel sessions before they end. If not, I'll certainly see everybody tomorrow. But again, hopefully I'll be back a little later.
Thank you, Mark.
Bye.
Bye for now.
All,
Bye.
All our support to our new school friends.
Absolutely, I will.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye.